It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away. I had rented a small cabin deep in the Australian bush to get some peace and escape the city noise. The rain started just as I turned onto the long, muddy driveway, and the dirt road quickly became a slippery mess. The cabin looked old but solid, surrounded by tall gum trees swaying in the wind. The rain wasn't slowing down, and the loud tapping of raindrops on the tin roof made everything feel even more cut off from the world. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. It had a small kitchen, a sitting area, and a single bedroom. There was no TV, no internet, and my phone barely got a signal. The only things to keep me company were a book and the constant sound of rain. First, I liked it. The quiet felt nice. But as night fell, the storm got worse. The wind howled through the trees, and I could hear branches snapping in the dark. I double-checked all the windows and doors to make sure they were locked. Being out here alone started to feel wrong. I told myself to relax and went to bed early. The rain was so loud it felt like it was going to break through the roof. Lying there in the dark, I couldn't stop hearing every creak, every groan of the cabin. The wind sounded closer with each gust, like it was trying to get inside. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my ears. Then I heard something different. It wasn't the rain or the wind. It was something moving outside. At first, it was faint, almost hidden by the storm. Maybe an animal, I thought. But the sound didn't stop. It was steady like footsteps. I froze in bed, holding my breath to listen. The sound got closer, crunching wet leaves and mud outside the cabin. My chest felt tight as my heart raced. I wanted to believe it was just a kangaroo or some other animal, but the steps sounded too regular, too human. I sat up slowly, trying not to make a noise. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I turned toward the window. A flash of lightning lit up the yard for a split second, but I didn't see anything. Still, the footsteps kept going. They were circling the cabin now. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They weren't shouting or making themselves known. They were just walking, like they were waiting for something. I reached for the small flashlight I'd brought and held it tightly, my only weapon. I didn't have a gun, and my phone had no service out here. If someone tried to get in, I'd have no way to call for help. My mind raced through every worst-case scenario as I tried to stay calm. Another flash of lightning lit up the yard, and this time I saw it. A figure. They were standing perfectly still just beyond the edge of the trees. They didn't move. They didn't make a sound. They were just watching. I didn't know what to do. Running outside wasn't an option. The rain was coming down too hard, and I'd never outrun them in the mud. I didn't want to shine the flashlight or make any noise. The only thing I could think to do was stay as quiet as possible and hope they would go away. But they didn't. Hours passed, and I stayed in the same spot, barely breathing. The storm didn't stop, and neither did the figure. They moved closer at times, circling the cabin again and again. Once, I thought I heard the doorknob rattle softly. My stomach dropped, but the door held. I was grateful I had locked it earlier. As dawn started to break, the rain finally began to ease. The noises outside faded, too. I dared to peek out the window again. The figure was gone, but I still felt uneasy, like I was being watched. I packed up as fast as I could, not bothering to eat or clean. As soon as there was enough light to see, I jumped in my car and drove off. The driveway was a muddy mess, and my tires slipped and spun, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was almost hidden behind the trees now, but I thought I saw movement in the bush near the edge of the property. I didn't stop to check. I didn't want to know. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped at a cafe to calm down. I told myself it was over, that it was probably just some local messing around. But later, when I got home and unpacked my bag, I found something that didn't belong. My flashlight had a small, muddy handprint on it. It was smeared, like whoever left it had been dragging their fingers. It wasn't there before, I was sure of it. I hadn't used the flashlight outside. That's when I noticed something else. On the bottom of my bag, there was a clump of wet mud and crushed leaves, like someone had opened it and shoved their hand inside. My blood ran cold. Whatever or whoever it was, they hadn't just been outside. They'd gotten close enough to touch my things, close enough to leave a mark, and I had never even heard them. I had been sent to patrol a part of the US-Mexico border in a desert far from anywhere. It wasn't my first time working in a lonely area, but something about this place felt different. The land stretched on forever, dry and empty except for some thorny bushes, a few jagged hills, and old abandoned shacks. One of those shacks was my base for the job, a small, broken-down cabin sitting a few miles away from the main patrol route. It barely stood upright, with creaky wooden floors, a metal roof that rattled whenever the wind picked up, and a generator that only worked when it felt like it. My task was simple: watch the area for anyone crossing illegally or for cartel activity. At night, I used night vision gear to scan the land. The heat during the day made the nights feel strangely quiet. Sometimes I'd hear a coyote howling in the distance or the wind rushing through the hills, but most of the time, it was just silent. Too silent. After a few nights, I spotted something strange through the thermal scope. It wasn't unusual to see animals moving around, but this wasn't animals. A group of people was moving across the land, heading toward the hills. They moved carefully, like they knew what they were doing. There were too many of them for it to be random travelers. This wasn't a family or someone lost. They had a plan. I marked their direction on my map and decided to check it out the next morning. At sunrise, I started walking toward where I'd last seen them. The trail led me to a dry riverbed, then deeper into the hills. That's when I found the first sign that something wasn't right. A black patch of ground, like it had been burned, with empty shell casings scattered everywhere. There was no blood, no bodies, just the burned ground and a faint chemical smell that made my throat itch. I looked closer and saw fresh footprints heading further into the hills. I followed them, my stomach tightening with every step. The air felt heavy, and the silence was thick, like the land itself was holding its breath. Then I saw it, a cabin. It was bigger than mine, but in the same bad shape. What caught my eye was the shiny new padlock on the door. It looked out of place on the old, weathered wood. Something about it felt wrong, but I had to check it out. I broke the lock and stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with the same chemical smell I'd picked up earlier. The first room was empty except for an old table and chair. Then I noticed another door. This one was thick, reinforced with bolts, and the floor in front of it was scratched, like it had been opened and closed a lot recently. I opened it, and that's when I realized what they were hiding. The room was full of equipment, barrels, tubs, and containers that looked like they'd been thrown together quickly. It was a drug lab. My stomach turned when I saw boot prints leading to the back wall. Someone had been here not long ago. Maybe they still were. Suddenly, the generator died, and the cabin went pitch black. The quiet was broken by the sound of footsteps outside. I froze, straining to hear. The footsteps got closer, then stopped, replaced by low murmurs. Whoever they were back. I moved fast, slipping out through a side window and into the bushes. I crouched down, barely breathing, as I watched shadows moving around the cabin. There were 3 or 4 of them. One had a rifle slung over his shoulder, and another carried a large bag. They walked into the cabin, leaving the door wide open. I didn't wait. Keeping low, I started moving away, step by step, careful not to make a sound. My training kept me calm, even though my heart was pounding. Once I was far enough, I used my radio to call for backup and gave them the location. The response was quick. Drones would be sent first, followed by a tactical team. I stayed hidden until I heard the faint hum of a drone overhead. Hours passed before the tactical team reached the cabin. They found the lab and a tunnel hidden under the floor that stretched toward the border. But the men I'd seen had disappeared. All they left behind were their footprints and the strange feeling that someone was still watching. I went back to my own cabin that night, but I couldn't relax. For weeks, I felt like I wasn't alone. Small things started to happen. Scuff marks in the dirt outside my cabin door. My gear moved slightly out of place. I tried telling myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. One night, the generator sputtered out again. I sat there in the dark, gripping my rifle, listening. The cabin felt like it was closing in on me. After a while, I heard something outside, slow, steady footsteps crunching in the dirt. I didn't move, barely breathing as the steps circled the cabin. Then they stopped. I waited for what felt like hours before I finally got up to check. When I opened the door, the night was still, the air cold. But there in the dirt, right in front of my cabin, was a single boot print. Fresh, too fresh. They weren't just watching me. They were letting me know they could get closer anytime they wanted. And this time, I wouldn't see them coming. I rented a cabin deep in the Amazon rainforest because I needed a break from everything. It was far from anything, surrounded by thick trees and the sounds of animals. Felt like the right place to clear my mind. My dog, Max, came with me. He's a German shepherd, smart and protective. Having him there made me feel a little safer. The cabin was basic. A small wooden house with a little kitchen and a porch where I could look out at the jungle. For the first couple of days, I stayed close to the cabin. I only went on short walks with Max, not too far into the forest. Max acted a bit nervous. His ears kept twitching, and he'd stop to stare into the trees. I figured he just wasn't used to the place. On the third night, Max started growling. It was quiet at first, just a low sound in his throat. He stood at the door, completely still, staring outside. I grabbed my flashlight and looked through the window. The jungle was quiet, too quiet. It wasn't the usual noise I had gotten used to. No insects, no animals, nothing. Max wouldn't calm down. His growling got louder, so I decided to check outside. I stepped onto the porch and pointed the flashlight toward the trees. The beam lit up the thick plants, but nothing seemed out of place. Just as I turned to go back inside, Max barked. A deep, angry bark. His fur was standing up, and he looked ready to attack. Then I saw it. Something moved between the trees. It wasn't fast like an animal. It was slow, like someone creeping around. My stomach tightened, and my hands felt cold. Who would be out here this far into the jungle? I backed into the cabin and locked the door. Max stayed by the window, his eyes glued to the trees. I sat down and tried to tell myself it was probably just a hunter or someone who got lost. But it didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when the noises started. First, it was soft rustling outside, like someone stepping through the leaves. Then there were taps on the walls, faint but clear. I turned off all the lights and sat on the floor with Max by my side. My flashlight felt useless in my hands. The tapping stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. Hours dragged by. Every sound the cabin made, every creak or groan, made me jump. I kept staring at the windows, expecting to see someone or something staring back. Just when I thought it might be over, Max barked again, louder than before. He ran to the back window, and I followed him, my heart pounding. Scratches. Long, deep marks had been carved into the back door. They were fresh, the wood splintered and raw. I knew no animal could have done that. I didn't wait to find out what it was. As soon as the sun came up, I grabbed what I could, threw it into the car, and left. The drive out of the jungle felt like it took forever. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone running after us. When I reached the closest town, I told a few locals about what happened. They didn't look surprised. One older man finally told me that strange things happen to people who stay too deep in the forest. He said people hear noises, feel like they're being watched, and sometimes find marks like the ones on my door. But no one ever sees who does it. Even now, back home, I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. Max hasn't been the same since. He growls at nothing and refuses to sleep near doors or windows. Last night, I noticed scratches on the frame of my bedroom window. They were faint, but they were there. I don't know if I brought something back with me or if it just decided to follow. But now I'm afraid it doesn't matter where I go. I stayed with my grandma in her small cabin in a village surrounded by thick trees. It was always calm there, far from the noise of the city. I'd help her with simple things, carrying firewood, tidying the house, or planting in her garden. She didn't have much but never seemed to need anything more. This time, I planned to stay a few days before going back home. I loved the quiet evenings when we sat on the porch, listening to the forest sounds. But the nights felt different. They weren't just quiet. They felt heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something. On my second night, while I was getting ready to sleep, I smelled something strange. It was like something burning. It wasn't coming from the fireplace or the stove. It was faint, like burnt wood or leaves, and it drifted in through the window. I stepped outside to check. The air was still, and the trees stood like walls. There was no fire, no smoke. I shut the window tight and went to bed, trying to forget about it. The next day, I told my grandma. She didn't seem worried. She just said, "Sometimes it happens," and moved on. I thought maybe someone in the village was burning trash, but I hadn't seen anyone near the cabin. That night, the smell came back, stronger. It was thick and sharp, hanging in the air. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside again. The woods felt wrong. The trees looked bigger, their shadows stretching across the ground like they were alive. I kept turning, shining the light, but I saw nothing, just branches and leaves. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I turned to go back inside, I saw something strange. The tools we'd left by the garden shed were scattered everywhere. The rake was tipped over, the bucket was on its side, and the small spade was lying far from where it had been. We hadn't used them that day. It looked like someone had kicked them over. I told myself it was just the wind, even though the air had been completely still. That night, I made sure to lock every door and window in the cabin. I lay in bed, straining to hear any sounds. At first, it was the usual creaks of the old cabin and soft rustling from outside. But around midnight, I heard something else. It was a faint crunch, like footsteps on dried leaves. They were slow, moving around the cabin. I stayed completely still, my heart racing. The sound stopped near my bedroom window. I stared at the thin curtain, my breath caught in my throat. I thought I saw a shadow move across it, but I didn't dare get up to look. I stayed frozen until morning. When I went outside, I saw footprints in the dirt under my window. They were human, bare feet pressed deep into the soft ground. The trail led into the woods. I told my grandma, and for the first time I saw her look scared. She told me not to go outside at night anymore. She didn't explain why, and I didn't push her to. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed in the main room of the cabin, waiting. Around the same time as before, I heard the footsteps again. This time they didn't circle the cabin. They stopped at the back door. Then I heard the door handle rattle. It wasn't quick. It was slow, like whoever was out there wanted to see if they could open it quietly. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and stood in the center of the room. My legs felt like they would give out, but I forced myself to stay standing. The handle rattled again, harder this time. Then it stopped. I waited for hours, but nothing else happened. When the sun came up, I finally opened the back door. Muddy handprints covered the wood, smudged and smeared, as if whoever it was had pressed their palms against the door and leaned on it. We didn't stay another night. My grandma and I packed what we could and left the cabin that morning. She didn't say a word as we walked to the bus stop, but her face told me she was just as scared as I was. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, years later, I can't stop thinking about it. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to rob us or break in for food. They didn't want anything like that. They were watching us, testing us, waiting for something. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the handprints on the door. They weren't smeared in a random way. They were low on the wood, like they belonged to someone crawling or something pretending to crawl. I had just turned 65 and decided to spend a few days alone at my cabin up in the mountains. It was a quiet place, a retreat from everything, just the way I liked it. I hadn't been there in a while, so I thought it would be a good time to get away and enjoy the peace. The first day went by fine. I spent most of it cleaning the cabin, chopping some wood, and making sure the old stove was working. It was calm up there, almost too calm. The air was fresh, and the weather was clear. Felt like nothing could go wrong. When the evening came and the sun started to set, I decided to take a walk along the creek that ran through the property. The trees were still full of leaves, their long shadows stretching over the ground as the light faded. It was nice and quiet, but there was this feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off. It was just the quiet, I told myself, and kept walking. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and settled in for the night. The wind had started to pick up, and it made an eerie sound as it blew through the trees. The house felt cold, even though it was warm outside. I climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. That feeling, being watched, came back again. It made my skin crawl. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, a bear or maybe a deer. But then I realized it was too heavy, too purposeful. It was the sound of footsteps. Slowly, I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and quietly moved to the window. What I saw made my heart stop. There was a figure standing near the tree line, just outside the cabin. It was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dark hooded jacket that blended into the night. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, staring, trying to make sense of it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was racing. Should I call the sheriff? But I knew it would take too long for anyone to get up here. I couldn't trust anyone but myself. I stayed there, sitting on the floor by the window, flashlight in hand, watching the figure. It didn't move for what felt like forever. It was like time stopped. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I kept the flashlight on and kept watching the window, sure that someone, was out there. Every little sound, every creak of the cabin, made my heart race. Morning didn't come soon enough. When the first light of day finally broke, I stepped cautiously outside. Everything looked normal, too normal, but there was something unsettling in the air, like I wasn't the only one there. I started walking around the cabin, checking the ground, looking for anything that might tell me who or what had been outside. And then I saw them, footprints, fresh ones, leading from the tree line toward the back of the cabin. They were too big for any animal I knew. I could see the prints clearly in the soft earth, and they weren't made by someone in a hurry. They were slow, careful, like the person had been trying to stay quiet. That's when it hit me. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing by. They had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Maybe they'd been watching me the whole time. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my things, leaving my coffee half finished and not bothering to pack anything extra. I locked the cabin door behind me and hurried to the car. The drive down the mountain felt endless. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. And for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the trees, but when I looked again, it was gone. I don't know who or what that person was, and I don't want to know. That cabin is staying locked up, and I won't be going back alone again. The thought of it still chills me to the bone. I keep seeing that figure in my mind, standing by the trees, watching. I don't know if they were waiting for me to leave or if they wanted me to stay. Either way, I feel like I got out just in time. And the worst part? The footprints I found weren't the only ones. There were others, small and barely noticeable, leading deeper into the woods. Footprints that weren't there when I first walked outside. They had been there the whole time. Whoever had been out there, they hadn't just been watching me from the shadows. They'd been waiting for me to notice. I had rented a small cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway with my sister, Emma. We just wanted a break from our busy lives, a chance to get away from everything, relax, and enjoy the peace of nature. The cabin was basic, 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a porch with a view of the trees. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but that's exactly what we were looking for. The first morning, Emma decided to go for a walk. I stayed behind to make breakfast, thinking she'd be back in an hour or so. She loved exploring, and I wasn't concerned. I watched her walk down the dirt path that led deeper into the woods, her backpack bouncing on her shoulders as she disappeared into the trees. An hour passed, then 2. I started to feel uneasy. I went outside and called her name, but the woods just swallowed the sound. I walked down the path a bit, yelling for her, but nothing. There was no response. The silence felt thicker than usual, like the trees were holding their breath. By the 3rd hour, I was getting really worried. I grabbed my phone and tried calling her. No signal. I rushed back to the cabin, grabbed a flashlight and a bottle of water, and headed into the woods. I kept thinking I'd find her sitting on a rock, maybe just lost in her thoughts. But the deeper I went, the more I realized I had no idea where she could be. The trails kept splitting, turning into more paths that all looked the same, and her footprints had long disappeared in the dust. I walked for hours, calling out her name until my throat hurt. My chest felt tight, and panic was creeping in, but I couldn't stop. As the sun started to set, the shadows grew longer, and the forest seemed to get darker, colder. It felt like the trees were closing in around me. I finally had to admit it. I was lost too. When I found my way back to the cabin, it was nearly dark. I grabbed the car keys, hopped in the car, and drove the 20 minutes back to the nearest town. The sheriff's office was quiet, with just one officer sitting behind the desk. I told him about Emma and how she was missing. He said they'd send out a search team. The next day, search teams fanned out across the woods. I stayed at the cabin, hoping she'd somehow come back on her own. But as the hours went by, I started to lose hope. The woods were huge, and the thought that she could be somewhere out there, and I might never find her, haunted me. By the 2nd day, they found her backpack. It was by a creek, zipped up and untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks, nothing. It was like she had just set it down and walked away. Days turned into weeks. The search teams left, the news stopped covering the story, and people started moving on. But I couldn't let it go. I stayed at the cabin, retracing every step, searching every inch of the forest. Every snap of a branch or rustle in the leaves made my heart race, but I never found anything. One night, after hours of searching, I sat on the porch, tired, staring into the dark forest. That's when I noticed something strange. On the far side of the clearing, near where the woods started again, I saw a small pile of rocks. It wasn't there before. I stood up and walked over. My heart started pounding as I got closer. The rocks were stacked carefully, like someone had placed them there on purpose. And underneath them, I saw it. Emma's jacket, folded neatly, as if she had just left it there. It wasn't dirty or torn, just sitting there, like someone wanted me to find it. I called the police right away, but they couldn't explain it. They said it could have been anyone who found her jacket and left it there. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. It felt like a message, like something Emma had left for me, or maybe something or someone else. It didn't make sense, but it was real. Weeks turned into months. I stopped searching, but I couldn't forget about the jacket, the pile of stones, and the way the woods felt when I stood there alone. I left the cabin behind, but the memory of it still haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't understand. Then one night, not long after I left, I had a dream. I saw Emma in the woods, standing by that same pile of rocks. But this time, she was looking right at me. Her eyes were wide, like she was trying to tell me something, but there was no sound. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The dream stayed with me for days, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw her there, staring at me from the trees. And then, a few months later, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Someone else had gone missing in those woods. A hiker, a few miles from where Emma disappeared. They found his backpack just like hers. No signs of struggle, no footprints, just the backpack lying there. I never went back to the woods, but sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear the sound of footsteps outside my window. It's always quiet, too quiet, like someone's walking through the forest, just out of sight. And sometimes, when I go for a walk, I find stones stacked up just like the ones near the cabin. It's almost like the forest is trying to tell me something, but I don't think I'll ever understand what it is. I just hope that whatever it is, it's done with me. I decided to get away for a while and leave the noise of the city behind, so I rented a small cabin deep in the woods for the weekend. The place was quiet, tucked away between thick trees with no one around for miles. At first, everything felt perfect. The air was fresh, the silence was peaceful, and I finally felt calm, something I hadn't felt in a long time. The first day, I spent hiking around, enjoying the peace and being alone. As the sun began to set, I headed back to the cabin, built a fire, and sat by it to warm up. The crackling of the flames filled the silence, and I couldn't help but think how lucky I was to be in such a quiet, beautiful place. As the night grew darker, the woods outside got even quieter, except for the soft sound of the wind moving through the trees. That's when I started hearing it. At first, it was just a small sound, like a twig snapping somewhere far off. I thought it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it again and again. It sounded like someone was walking around outside the cabin. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind or some animal moving around. But then I heard something more clear, a thud, like a heavy footstep, right outside the door. I froze. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was nothing. The cabin was far from any road or town, so the idea of someone being out here seemed impossible. Still, the noises didn't stop. They moved around the cabin from one side to the other. I could hear something scraping against the wall, faint sounds, like whispers in the air. Nothing I could explain. The air felt different, tense, like it was charged with something I couldn't see. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it could be, but nothing made sense. The The fire was almost out now, just a few embers left glowing in the dark. I grabbed a flashlight from the table, my hands shaking as I tried to calm myself. I opened the door and stepped outside, not thinking too much. I just had to see what was out there. Nothing. The woods were still. But as I stood there, the flashlight beam caught something. Footprints in the mud near the porch. They were fresh, and they led away into the trees. I couldn't move. My mind went blank, and my stomach turned. Someone had been out there, close enough to the cabin to leave prints in the mud. I slammed the door shut and locked it fast. I could hear my breathing, fast and sharp in the silence. The sounds outside stopped. No more scraping, no more footsteps, no more whispers. Just quiet. I sat in the corner, gripping the flashlight, trying to think, but my mind wouldn't stop running. There was no one out here, no one for miles. But those footprints were real. Someone had been outside. I stayed awake all night, too scared to sleep, too scared to move. I kept imagining what could be out there, who could be watching the cabin. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't alone. The fear was like a weight on my chest, heavy and suffocating. By morning, I was exhausted, my body aching from sitting still all night. The sun came up, and I finally felt brave enough to leave the corner. I checked the door and windows. I stepped outside. The prints were gone. The rain or wind could have washed them away, I told myself. There was no sign of anyone, but I still felt it, the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone had been there and maybe still was. I didn't want to risk another night. I packed my things quickly, not even bothering to clean up the cabin, and left. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I drove away, my eyes constantly glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, coming out of the trees behind me. But nothing ever showed up. The woods were silent again, just as they had been when I first arrived. It was too quiet. I thought I had imagined everything, that I was just shaken up from the night's fear. But as I got closer to the city, something didn't sit right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched the whole time I was there, and that feeling stayed with me even after I returned home. Weeks later, I still think about that cabin. I can't get rid of the feeling that whoever or whatever was out there that night never really left. They were waiting for me to leave. Maybe they still are. And maybe, just maybe, they're still watching.